I never expected that a burst pipe in my neighbor's apartment would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. Before that, my life was a series of quiet, predictable loops. I'm Miles. I work from home as a freelance copy editor, which is a polite way of saying I spend most of my days in a silent battle with the grammar of strangers. My apartment was my sanctuary, a small, cozy space filled with books and the low hum of my laptop. It was a good life, a stable one. But if I were being honest with myself, it was also a lonely one. My world was neatly contained within those four walls. The window over my desk looked out onto the building's shared courtyard, a small patch of struggling grass, and a few weathered benches. It was through that window that I lived a kind of adjacent life, observing the comings and goings of my neighbors. I knew who got takeout every Tuesday, who had a new significant other, who was learning to play the guitar with more enthusiasm than skill. I was an audience of one, safe behind the glass. And then Caleb moved into the apartment across the hall, 2B. His arrival wasn't quiet. It was a cheerful cacophony of heavy boots on the old wooden floors, the scrape of furniture being moved, and music that vibrated just enough to be felt rather than heard. He was a force of nature in our quiet little building. I'd see him in the hallway, his work boots caked with mud, a smear of dirt on his cheek, his t-shirts often stained with grass or something that looked suspiciously like paint. He worked in landscaping, I gathered, a job that seemed to suit his broad shoulders and the easy, physical confidence he carried. He was handsome in a way that felt almost unfair. Sun-streaked brown hair that was always a little messy, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and a steady, direct gaze. Whenever we passed each other, he'd give me a nod and a quiet, "Hey," and my heart would perform a ridiculous little flip. I'd just nod back, my own, "Hey," barely a whisper. In my mind, he was a different species. He was the kind of guy who played sports on the weekend and drank beer with a dozen friends. He was, I assumed with a familiar pang of resignation, completely and utterly straight. He existed in a world of bright, loud color, while I lived in soft grayscale. So, I kept watching from my window, content to keep him as a pleasant, unattainable feature of my daily landscape. That's how things were for months. A routine of silent nods and my own private, ridiculous pining. I knew the sound of his keys in the lock. I knew he sometimes hummed when he walked down the stairs. These were the small, secret details I collected, treasures I stored away without any hope of them ever meaning anything more. Life was predictable, until one Tuesday evening, when predictability went right out the window. I was making dinner when I heard a frantic series of thumps from the hallway, followed by a loud, frustrated groan. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened my door a crack and saw Caleb standing there, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his hair. Water was seeping from under his doorway, a dark, ominous stain spreading across the worn hallway runner. "No, I get that it's an old building," he was saying, his voice tight with stress. "But my entire living room is currently becoming a shallow pond." "A week? You think it's going to take a week to fix?" He listened for a moment, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll figure something out." He hung up and just stood there for a second, staring at the encroaching puddle as if it had personally betrayed him. He looked completely lost, the usual confidence gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that struck me more than any of his easy smiles ever had. And then, something inside me just broke loose. Some long-dormant impulse to do more than just observe. Before I could second-guess myself, before my anxiety could pull me back inside and lock the door, I opened it all the way. He looked up, startled. "Hey," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have a spare room. It's not much, just a bed and a desk. But if you need a place to stay for a few days, you're welcome to it." Caleb stared at me. For a second, I was sure he was going to refuse, that my offer was too forward, too weird. I braced myself for the polite rejection. But then, the tension in his face dissolved into sheer, unadulterated relief. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, of course." "Wow. Man, that would be amazing," he breathed out, a genuine, grateful smile spreading across his face. "Thank you. Seriously. I'm Caleb, by the way." "I'm Miles," I replied, a small smile finding its way to my own lips. Welcome to 2A, I guess. And just like that, the barrier of the hallway, the glass of my window, and all my careful observations dissolved. The force of nature from across the hall was about to come into my quiet, orderly world. I had no idea if I was ready for the chaos, but a thrilling, terrifying part of me couldn't wait to find out. Let me explain something about my apartment. It was small, cozy for one person, but with two grown men, it shrank considerably. Suddenly, my solitary sanctuary was a shared space, and the silence I was so accustomed to was filled with new sounds. The clink of his coffee mug next to mine in the morning, the soft thud of his duffel bag on the floor of the spare room, the low rumble of his voice when he took a phone call. It was an invasion, but a surprisingly welcome one. The first couple of days were a dance of careful politeness. We tiptoed around each other, both hyper-aware of the other's presence. Sorry became our most used word as we bumped elbows in the narrow kitchen or tried to navigate the small bathroom. But slowly, the awkwardness began to meld away, replaced by a comfortable, domestic rhythm I never would have anticipated. We fell into a routine. I'd be up first, making coffee, and I started making enough for two without even thinking about it. He'd emerge from the spare room, hair still damp from a shower, and murmur his thanks with a sleepy smile that did ridiculous things to my stomach. In the evenings, instead of eating alone at my desk, we'd eat together at my small dining table. It was during these meals that I started to see beyond the confident, handsome neighbor I'd built up in my head. I learned that he was a landscape designer, not just a laborer. He didn't just move dirt and plant trees. He created entire ecosystems, designing gardens and parks with an artist's eye. He talked about soil composition and native plant species with a passion that was infectious. He'd come home exhausted, covered in a day's worth of honest labor, and his entire being would light up as he described the progress on a new community garden he was building. He was curious about my work, too. He'd ask me what I was editing, and I'd try to explain the intricacies of a historical nonfiction manuscript or the subtle character arcs in a fantasy novel. He was a surprisingly good listener, asking thoughtful questions that made me realize how rare it was for me to talk about my own passions with anyone. My quiet, gray world was suddenly being flooded with color, and that color was Caleb. My perception of him was shifting so quickly. The untouchable guy from across the hall was becoming a real, flesh-and-blood person who left his socks on the floor and had a surprisingly goofy laugh. One evening, I walked into the living room and found him sitting on the floor, leaning against the sofa with a sketchbook open on his lap. He was so engrossed in what he was doing that he didn't hear me come in. I saw pages filled not with rough construction plans, but with delicate, intricate drawings of flowers I didn't know the names of winding stone paths and elaborate water features. They were beautiful, filled with a grace and detail that seemed at odds with his calloused, dirt-stained hands. He finally looked up and saw me standing there. A flush crept up his neck, and he quickly closed the sketchbook. "Oh, hey, didn't hear you," he said, suddenly shy. "Those are incredible," I said, my voice soft with genuine awe. "You're a real artist." He shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "It's just ideas. Stuff the clients never go for. Too expensive, too complicated. It's the part of the job I love, you know?" The creating part, he looked down at his sketchbook, a wistful expression on his face. In that moment, he seemed less like a force of nature and more like someone with a secret, fragile dream. It was a crack in his confident facade, a glimpse of a vulnerability that made my heart ache in a way that was entirely new. This was the Caleb I was beginning to fall for, not just the handsome exterior, but the thoughtful, artistic soul hiding just beneath the surface. The days bled into a week, and the news from the landlord was that the repairs were taking longer than expected. I felt a surge of relief that was so strong it almost scared me. I wasn't ready for him to leave. I wasn't ready to go back to the silence. That night, a cold front blew in, rattling the old windows of the apartment and making the whole place feel drafty. I was curled up on the armchair in my favorite hoodie. It was an old, ridiculously soft fleece thing, oversized and worn in all the right places. It was my comfort object, the thing I wore when I was feeling stressed or just needed to feel secure. Caleb came out of his room, shivering dramatically. "Geez, it got cold fast," he said, rubbing his arms. His eyes landed on my hoodie. "That looks ridiculously comfortable," he commented with a small smile. It is, I agreed. The official uniform of the professional hermit. He chuckled at that. We watched a movie, the wind howling outside, the warmth of the apartment a cozy bubble against the chill. Later, after I'd gone to bed, I got up for a glass of water and saw him asleep on the couch. He'd kicked off the throw blanket in his sleep and was curled into a ball, a slight shiver running through him. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him. The impulse came from the same place as the one that had made me offer him my room. It was a feeling that bypassed thought, a pure, instinctual need to offer comfort. Quietly, I pulled the hoodie over my head. The fleece was warm from my own body heat. I hesitated for only a second before gently draping it over him. It was a ridiculously intimate gesture. The hoodie smelled like me, my laundry detergent, my skin, my life. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment, clouded with sleep. Cold, he mumbled, his voice thick. Here, I whispered, nudging the hoodie closer. He fumbled with it, pulling it on without seeming to be fully awake. He immediately settled, a soft sigh escaping his lips as he burrowed into the fleece. He was wearing my hoodie. He was asleep on my couch, wrapped in my scent, and the sight sent a wave of something warm and hopeful and terrifying right through me. I went back to my room, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. Something was happening between us, something more than just circumstance, and I had no idea what to do about it. A couple of days later, the landlord finally gave him the all-clear. His apartment was dry, repaired, and ready for him to move back in. The news landed in my stomach like a stone. I should have been happy for him, relieved to get my space back, but all I felt was a profound sense of impending loss. The silence was coming back, and I found that I was terrified of it. The final evening felt charged with unspoken words. We ate dinner quietly, the usual easy conversation replaced by a stilted awareness that this was the end of our strange, temporary life together. I was already mourning the loss of his presence, the warmth he brought to my small apartment. After we cleared the table, he disappeared into the spare room and came back holding my hoodie. It was folded neatly, and I could smell the fresh, clean scent of my own laundry detergent from across the room. He'd washed it. Figured I should give this back before I forget, he said, his voice a little strained. He held it out to me. Thanks, I said, reaching for it. But as my fingers brushed against his, he didn't let go. He pulled it back slightly. Here, he said, his voice low. Let me. I was confused for a second, but then he unfolded the hoodie and held it open. It was a clear, silent invitation. My heart started to beat a little faster. I turned my back to him, my body buzzing with a nervous energy that was almost painful. I slipped my arms into the sleeves he held for me, and he gently guided the hoodie up and over my shoulders. For a moment, we were frozen like that, his hands resting on my shoulders, his body just inches from my back. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could almost feel the rhythm of his breathing. The gesture was so tender, so unexpectedly domestic, it made my breath catch in my throat. I pulled the hoodie down over my torso and tugged the hood up over my head, a nervous habit. The soft fleece settled around me, warm from the dryer, but it was his warmth I was most aware of. I took a deep breath and turned around to face him, and everything stopped. He hadn't moved back. He was standing so close I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. So close that the air between us felt thick and electric. The hood of the sweatshirt created a strange little world for just the two of us, framing my face and muffling the sounds of the city outside my window. It felt like we were the only two people on the planet. He lifted his hands, not to my face, but to the fabric of the hood itself. His fingers curled around the edges, his thumbs resting gently on the fleece just beside my temples. He was holding the hood, cupping it around my head, creating a smaller, even more intimate space. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a question there, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. There was no confidence in his gaze now, only a raw, hopeful uncertainty. My own fear was a roaring in my ears, but the hope was louder. I gave him the slightest, most infinitesimal nod. That was all it took. He leaned in, closing the last remaining distance between us. His lips met mine, and it was the softest touch I had ever felt. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand, but one of pure, hesitant questioning. It was a gentle exploration, asking 1,000 things I couldn't put into words. I leaned into it, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart under my palm. The kiss deepened, no longer a question but an answer. It was slow and deliberate and breathtaking. The world outside the frame of my hoodie completely ceased to exist. There was only the soft fleece under his fingers, the warmth of his mouth on mine, and the staggering, overwhelming feeling of rightness. It was a moment suspended in time, a perfect, quiet explosion that rearranged my entire universe. He had brought my hoodie back, and in the process, he had given me a part of himself. When the kiss finally broke, we just stood there, foreheads resting together, breathing the same air. The silence that followed wasn't empty or awkward. It was full, humming with everything that had just passed between us. I was dizzy with it, completely unmoored. He didn't say a word. He just gently pulled the hood back from my head, his fingers brushing against my hair, and then he took a small step back, breaking the spell. I should finish packing, he murmured, his voice husky. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Good night, Miles. And then he was gone, retreating to the spare room and leaving me standing alone in the middle of my living room, my lips still tingling, my world tilted entirely on its axis. The warmth of the moment quickly began to cool, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't smiled. He had just left. And as I stood there, wrapped in a hoodie that now felt both like a promise and a painful reminder, I had a sinking feeling that I had just made a terrible, beautiful mistake. The next morning, Caleb was gone before I woke up. A key was on the kitchen counter with a small, neatly written note next to it. Thanks for everything, it read. That was it. No mention of the kiss. No, talk to you later, just a polite, final, and utterly devastating thank you. The vibrant color that had flooded my life for the past week and a half drained away, leaving everything a dull, aching gray once more. My apartment felt cavernous without him. The silence I had once cherished now felt oppressive, amplifying the sound of my own anxious thoughts. I went back to being an observer, but now, the hallway felt like a mile-wide chasm. A few times, I saw him coming or going. He'd see me, his eyes would widen for a fraction of a second, and then he'd give a tight, forced nod and hurry past, his gaze fixed on the floor. The easy, friendly greetings were gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating awkwardness. It was so much worse than before. Before, he was an unattainable object of my affection. Now, he was a question I couldn't answer, a wound I couldn't close. My brain went into overdrive, analyzing every single second of that kiss from every possible angle. Let me tell you, an editor's mind is a dangerous place to be when you're overthinking. I dissected it like a poorly constructed sentence, searching for flawed syntax and hidden meanings. Did I lean in too fast? Did I misread his expression completely? Maybe he was just caught up in the moment, a weird burst of emotion brought on by the intimacy of our living situation. That had to be it. He was a straight guy, curious for a fleeting second, and now he was deeply regretting it. He was probably embarrassed, weirded out, and just wanted to pretend it never happened. The silence from across the hall was his answer, and it was a resounding no. My hope, which had flared so brightly, was quickly being extinguished by a tidal wave of fear and insecurity. Each passing day of silence was another piece of evidence confirming my worst fears. I had ruined it. I had taken our burgeoning friendship and shattered it with one hopeful, disastrous kiss. I started actively avoiding him, timing my trips to the laundry room, or to check the mail for when I knew he'd be at work. The pain of seeing him and feeling that wall of awkwardness between us was too much to bear. I retreated back behind my window, but now, the view was tainted with regret. I spent 3 days in this self-imposed misery. 3 days of replaying our conversations, searching for clues I might have missed. 3 days of clutching the sleeve of that stupid hoodie as if it held some secret I couldn't decipher. I told myself to just get over it, to file Caleb away as a painful lesson in not getting my hopes up. It was better to go back to being lonely and safe than to live with this constant, anxious yearning. I was just starting to convince myself that I could do it, that I could rebuild my quiet, orderly life, when there was a knock on my door. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew it was him. I could feel it. I considered not answering, just pretending I wasn't home. It would be easier, safer. But then the knock came again, a little softer this time, a little more hesitant. And I knew I couldn't. I had to face it. I had to get the final, verbal rejection so I could finally, truly move on. I took a deep breath, walked to the door, and opened it. Caleb was standing there, looking just as nervous as I felt. He was twisting the hem of his t-shirt in his hands, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I come in for a second?" I just nodded, my own voice having abandoned me completely, and stepped aside to let him in. The prodigal neighbor had returned, and I had a terrible feeling he was here to officially break my heart. He walked into the middle of the living room, the same spot where he had kissed me, and the irony was not lost on me. He stood there for a long moment, hands shoved deep into his pockets, clearly struggling to find the right words. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until I couldn't take it anymore. "Look, Caleb," I started, deciding to just rip the Band-Aid off myself. "About the other night, you don't have to say anything. I get it. I misread things, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. We can just forget it happened and go back to being neighbors. It's fine." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but it felt necessary. He finally looked at me then, his expression a mixture of confusion and pain. "Forget it happened?" he echoed, his voice strained. "Miles, that's the last thing I want to do. I've been a complete idiot. I'm the one who should be sorry." I just stared at him, completely thrown. This was not the speech I had prepared for. "I've been wanting to talk to you for months," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "Ever since I moved in. I'd see you at your window, when I was in the courtyard. You always looked so focused, so calm. I was trying to work up the courage to do more than just nod at you in the hall, but I couldn't. I've never felt this way about a guy before. It's all new to me, and it's terrifying." He took a deep breath, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "When my pipe burst, it was a disaster, yeah, but my first thought wasn't about my ruined stuff. It was that this was my chance. My excuse. A friend offered me his couch, but I said no. I was hoping you'd do exactly what you did. I wanted an excuse to be near you, to see if this thing I was feeling was real." My mind was reeling, trying to process his words. He had chosen to stay with me. On purpose. "The kiss," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "That was the most real thing I've felt in a long time, and it scared the hell out of me. I freaked out. I thought I had pushed too far, that I had scared you off. When you were quiet the next morning, I thought I'd completely ruined everything. So I ran. I've spent the last 3 days pacing my apartment, calling myself a coward for not just talking to you." I stood there, speechless. Every theory I had meticulously constructed, every fear I had nurtured, was wrong. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I was. A slow, wonderful wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees buckle. "You thought I was quiet?" I finally managed to say, a weak, incredulous laugh escaping me. "Caleb, I thought you regretted it. I've spent the last 3 days convincing myself it was a mistake and that you couldn't stand to even look at me." A real, genuine smile finally broke through his worried expression, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "So, we're both just idiots, then?" he asked. "Seems that way," I said, my own smile finally returning. He closed the distance between us in 2 quick strides. This time, there was no hesitation. He framed my face with his hands, his touch firm and sure. "I don't regret it, Miles," he said, his voice full of conviction. "Not for a second." And then he kissed me again. It wasn't questioning or tentative like the first time. It was a kiss of certainty, of relief, of promises made and fears overcome. It was a kiss that said all the things we had been too scared to say out loud. It felt like coming home. We had navigated the awkward aftermath and found our way back to each other, not through assumptions or analysis, but through the simple, terrifying act of telling the truth. In the weeks that followed, my quiet, solitary life was completely and wonderfully upended. Our 2 separate apartments became one shared existence, a constant, easy back and forth across the hall. We went on actual dates, the kind where you sit across from each other in a restaurant and talk for hours, but my favorite moments were still the quiet ones. Sitting together on my couch, his leg pressed against mine, his sketchbook open on the coffee table next to my editing manuscript. We were 2 different worlds that had, against all odds, found a way to orbit each other perfectly. He taught me the names of the flowers he drew, and I read him passages from the books I loved. I discovered that his confident exterior was a protective shell around a deeply thoughtful and sensitive man. He learned that my quietness wasn't aloofness, but a habit born of a lifetime of observation. We were learning each other's language, and it was the most fascinating subject I had ever studied. Our lives, once so separate, began to weave together, creating a pattern that was stronger and more beautiful than anything I could have managed on my own. A few months later, we were curled up on my couch, watching some mindless movie on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was wearing the hoodie. It had become our hoodie, a shared comfort object, a symbol of how this whole incredible thing started. Caleb reached over and, with a soft, familiar gesture, pulled the hood up over my head, encasing us in our own little world, just like he had that first night. He leaned in, his nose brushing against mine in the soft darkness under the fleece. "Still my favorite," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. Then he kissed me, a slow, comfortable kiss that tasted like coffee and contentment. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he wasn't just talking about the hoodie. It's funny, isn't it? You can spend your life drawing neat, orderly lines, building safe walls to live inside. You think you have it all figured out, this quiet, predictable existence. And then one day a pipe bursts, a wall comes down, and the resulting chaos turns out to be the most beautiful, intricate design you could have ever imagined. All it takes is one small act of courage, one decision to open a door instead of keeping it closed. And in my case, a borrowed hoodie that ended up feeling more like home than any place I had ever known.